Actually, I don't have that ability. So if someone else who's organizing, please be able to do that.
I'll do it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, my name is Floyd Chan. I am based out of the North American office of idyn, and I am over here in Eastern time. It is actually just past 9:30 a.m. my time, but more than happy to walk through today's presentation of the product. So we are representing a number of different products as part of idyn, but as far as today's concerned, we're going to focus on the Object Manager Advanced. And a number of you are currently already using the product. There may be a few of you who are not aware of the feature sets available in the product. We will go through a high-level walkthrough through the feature set, and then we're going to focus on the most interesting reveal that has happened over the last week or two as we are rolling out the new version of Object Manager Advanced, version 14, officially available as of December the 10th, I think it is. And in this particular version, you will see that we have a number of tool sets that allows us to manage AL code and also the conversion from CAL to AL, which I think as technical people here on the call and as developers, this is a very exciting and interesting component, especially when you consider some of the complexities that Microsoft is putting in our way and making our lives a little bit more interesting in terms of how to manage our developments. So OMA at a high level, some of you may already know, has a number of different features. Some of these we'll be going through as well today. We'll be looking at where used and object history. We'll talk a little bit about the guideline checking, and for sure, we're going to spend a fair amount of time looking at the conversion from CAL to AL. And you'll also see that we'll have the ability to also go backwards from AL to CAL and AL to CAL, so either directions. And as well, you'll also see that we also have the ability to take even CAL if you're on older versions of NAV and be able to upgrade or downgrade the versions of the code that you've written in. You'll see that the tool kits that we have, the tool sets, which were originally designed for CAL, also apply to AL. So no functionality is lost as we move forward into the newer development environment, which we'll talk a little bit about today as well, which is moving away from CAL code in the object designer using the Seaside development environment and moving to VS Code. And we'll see a little bit of all that stuff in action. So without delay, let's move into the actual product and let's take a look at what's actually in the product. To do this, I have actually on my screen currently, I'm running a bunch of multiple screens, and I'm currently off my presentation screen. I'm just getting an image ready. And what I'm going to pull up actually is our good friend, the Seaside development environment. This environment I have built currently in a container. So this is running inside a Docker container on my laptop, which is where I'm currently presenting from. And I am currently running Business Central version 14. That's the spring release that came out just this year. And there's a reason why I'm currently showing you Business Central 14, which I'll get into more in depth as we go through the presentation. But you could be on whatever version of NAV that you might be currently running. Now, in this particular scenario, I have here now, again, my development environment. And imagine what you're looking at currently is your actual development environment. So this is where you are customizing Cal code, creating your solution, and perhaps customizing base objects here for a client, or perhaps for an ISV solution, or for whatever scenario that you might be working on. Okay, so in here, by the way, this is largely base NAV, so you won't see a lot of customization inside this object set. But in any case, imagine that this is my development environment. So this development environment is the one that we're all familiar with and we've grown to love over the years. And as you all know, you can very easily come in here and select an object like my customer table here and click on design and be able to get into the actual properties of that table and also get behind this screen and get into the actual triggers and be able to write your own custom code. So nothing new here. We all know how to do this, and it's pretty straightforward. Now, on top of this development environment, what you would normally is you would import the Object Manager Advanced objects, OMA for short. Okay, and you can see here these are the actual objects. And yes, they live in an ISV range, and the OMA objects are imported into your development environment. However, they do not hook into any of the base objects at all. So there's no touch points between the OMA objects and your development environment. So these objects live separately from your development, but within the same database. All right, and therefore, at some point, if you wish to, you could delete out the OMA objects without impact on the development objects that you're currently working on. All right, so with these objects in place then, why do we have them? So with the objects in place, now what happens is from the Windows client, and yes, you could be using the web client if you're on a newer version of NAV. It works exactly the same way. However, I'm a little bit more old school. I've been working with NAV now for 21 years, so I'm still very in love with the older clients, but I'm getting used to the new ones. So I'll be using primarily the Windows client, but you could be using the web client, and that's okay too. In this particular case, I am here in my BC14 Windows client, and because I've installed the OMA objects into the object designer in the back end, I now have a role center, and this role center is a developer role center. And imagine this is essentially a dashboard that allows you to manage your development work and gives you all your requirements in terms of visibility of what are you working on, what do I need to focus on, just like any other dashboard for any other role inside NAV. And of course, as you already know, customizable, configurable, and you can set it up however you want. What I want to do here is I want to focus in this page, and we're going to look at something here called Object Explorer. So the Object Explorer is essentially an extension of the Object Designer. So what you saw in the development client is also here, now from a Windows client perspective. So when we were looking at that customer table in Object Designer, I can also look at it from here inside the Object Explorer. And in fact, I'm going to do so. So I've selected now my customer table here, table number 18, and up in the ribbon, what you'll see is I actually have a function here called where used. If I click on this, I'm going to ignore this little question. It just simply means I've made some modifications in some of my objects, and it's asking whether I want to update the repository with the latest changes. I'll just say no for now, just to keep some time, so that we're not spending much time on it. And on my other screen, it popped up this page. So I just pulled it here into my presentation window. And now what you can see is all the metadata that's related to my actual customer table. So for example, as you can see, all the information around the date time stamp, high-level summaries of all the different components of my table, okay? But down in the lines is where we actually get into the more interesting stuff. So for example, I have my insert trigger on the table. So this is a table trigger. And you can actually see that there is 16 references to this insert trigger. And yes, that's a flow field. So in fact, I can drill down on it. And by drilling down on it, what it does is now it opens up another page, and it actually shows me the 16 places inside the code that an insert is actually called. So for example, here in table number 5050, the contact table, we can see that there's a function here called create customer. And inside that function, there's the code line cust.insert true, which invokes the customer insert trigger. And I can actually click here on my code button up in the ribbon. And I could actually drill down and look at the actual code if I wanted to. So you can see here it is. There's the actual code line inside that particular object, the contact table, as you can see up here in the header. If for some reason, if I felt that at this point I needed to modify that line of code and I felt that this is the proper place to do it, I can in fact from here invoke the object designer. And as soon as I click on that button, what has happened is actually, just give me a moment, it's actually calling it up on another window. It's actually opening up my object designer, my development client, and it's just logging in, so I actually can't pull it over, but let me just pull it over here. Oh, and I just realized actually here, so it was opening up my development environment, and I actually just realized that, let me just close it now that I've pulled it into my primary window. Let's just see if it's going to open it up here. Yep. Okay, so what it would normally do is open the actual development environment through my development client and actually log me in and point to the actual object and code line so that I could actually make modifications. Now, in this particular case, I just realized that probably last week I was doing another demo and I just changed my my database pointer. So I probably just need to fix that. So I apologize. What would normally happen here is it would open up my actual object designer with in this case, the contact table at the code line where I could actually make the modification and save it. So basically it's just passing the wrong parameters through. So in any case, you can imagine what is the correct function here. So what would happen is at that point, when you actually save the contact table inside the object designer, because OMA is fully synchronized with the development environment. If I hit escape here and go all the way back to the beginning here, what will happen is here in the history is you will actually have a copy of each time the customer table, well, in this case, it would have been the contact table, but let's say I modified the customer table. You would actually get in here essentially a ledger entry, one record per modification. And what happens is actually for each one of these entries, the actual code and a copy of the FOB in a blob format is actually stored against that particular record. So the idea here is perhaps if you make 1,000 changes on the customer table, in this particular case, you would have 1,000 entries in here. And against every one of those entries, you would actually have stored against it is the actual code at the time that you made the save. So at any point, you could actually go back in the history of your different objects and you could actually look at the code. So you would be actually looking at the actual code of that particular version at that particular time. Okay, or if you wanted to, you could actually, by holding down your control button, select any two lines, as you can imagine, and I can actually hit compare. And when you hit compare in the OMA setup, you can actually choose your choice of comparison tool like Araxis or Beyond Compare or some other third-party tool. And it will actually pull up the two versions of the code and give you a side-by-side comparison so you can actually see the differences between those two pieces of code. So very useful. And also at any point in time, if you wanted to, you could also pull forward an old version of the code and bring it up so it becomes present and the most current version of the code. So all history is stored here and fully accessible and fully referenceable. So that's kind of cool. All right, let me go back into the where used. And again, because I made some changes from before, I'll just say no. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the metadata in here. So I can see that there is, again, 16 inserts called throughout the code, of which it's called insert true 11 times out of the 16. And again, of course, I could drill into that just to verify that that is the case. You can see that these are all now called with the true parameter, so that I could actually see that those were invoking any trigger code that's within this insert trigger. Scroll down. We also expose the keys, so you can also see where the keys are used throughout the application. And not only that, you can see that some of these keys are showing up in green. This simply means that they are not used anywhere in the code. So currency code, even though it exists as a key, actually is not referenced inside the code, and therefore may be worth considering as something that you might want to disable in order to reduce the amount of overhead. Typically what happens is these keys in the old days were used primarily by NAV for the purposes of sort rather than filtering. And in a SQL Server environment, a sort is simply managed through the order by, which gets translated from cal code into SQL Server statements at the time that you actually run the function. And therefore, this is actually not needed as a key anymore, as we used to need it under the old classic environment. So you can actually reduce the amount of database overhead every time you do an insert, modify, and delete by perhaps removing these sort-only keys. As I scroll down, you'll see that now we get into fields, and you can see, for example, here is, whoops, just scrolled a little too fast. There we go. The name field. You can see the name field is referenced 328 times in the code. And again, I can drill down and look at all those different reference points, of which the 328 times, 11 of those, give me a second here, is someone else presenting their screen. Give me a second, 1 second. It seems like we've switched over presentation screens. Give me a second. Let me share my screen again. Okay, perfect. I believe we are sharing my screen again. Yes. All right. I'm talking about fields and referencing fields. I was talking about the fact that the the name field here is used 328 times in the code, of which 11 of those 328 times, this is where the name field is being assigned a value. So this is now where you can actually see the population of the name field and where it's actually being put into the field from some other source, right? And of those 11 times that we're doing the assignment, 5 of those are with validation. So this is where I can actually drill into it. And now you can see it's with the validate parameter here. Okay, so I can look at fields, scroll down. I can also, way down at the bottom, look at functions, right? So for example, show contact function inside the customer table called 6 times throughout the code. And again, I can drill down here and I can see all the different points from which it's being called. You'll notice also that I've got a function here, global function, which is in blue. I can select the 2 here, drill into it. And in this particular case, these 2 calls to this function are actually called from within the customer table. So if it's being called from within the customer table, then perhaps this shouldn't be a global function. This perhaps could also be a local function instead. So the system does also point out to you that perhaps this is something that you need to look at and perhaps correct. And all these things are actually correctable with actually a push of a button. So OMA does actually allow you to fix all these kinds of potential errors with just simply a single click and go through your choice of objects and fix all these different scenarios. All right, so that's a quick little look at where used and a little bit about history and Object Explorer. Let's talk about a few more things then. Built into OMA, is also Guideline Checks. So you can invoke it by simply clicking here on Check Guidelines. These are typical Microsoft well, first of all, Microsoft guidelines in terms of conventions and how code should be put together. The nice thing about OMA is that you can also extend upon these guidelines, and you can also add your own guidelines. And you can actually define, perhaps for your own development style, how you might want certain things to appear or be checked, and therefore you can also check against your own standards. So in this particular case, if I say check guidelines, I've already run this earlier this morning. What it actually does is it creates these comments. So what you can actually drill down on is to take a look at some of the guideline that perhaps aren't being met. All right. So again, you can review all these. You can, with any choice you want, you can also go into the actual code or perhaps go directly into design mode, and you can actually correct some of these things. In this case, as you can see, this end at the end of probably a trigger is missing a semicolon, which from a functional perspective is allowed, but from a standard perspective is probably not a good practice. You should probably have a semicolon at the end of every line, even the very last line, even though it's allowed. Again, you can manually change all these things, or once again, OMA will give you the capability, if you so choose, to manually, automatically update these things and correct them for you with a push a button. So some great functionality in here as well. Let me jump out of the check guidelines, and let's talk a little bit more about a few other areas of OMA. So let me jump down here into object tools. Let's see here, actually, I think, yeah, right here. And let me just stretch this out because there's a little bit more stuff hiding down here in the navigation pane. So object tools. Some interesting pieces of functionality up here. We have the ability to renumber objects. You likely are already doing this. Some of you without OMA are probably already manually renumbering objects, and that's fine. It works very much the same way, so that you can actually go and renumber an object, from a number to a number. And as you also probably are doing in your development environment, you know that you have the capability in a table to be able to renumber a field. However, typically what would happen is you would probably need to, for that table, if there is any data, probably create something like an XML port, move the data out of the field, renumber the field, and then probably through another XML port, bring the data back in and perhaps do a transformation on that data in order to land it back in the renumbered field. The nice thing about this functionality is that we can actually renumber fields with data in place, so that you can actually go through and do that without much work. Okay. Let's take a few more things. Very shortly, I'm going to go through all this stuff, and we're going to get to the real cool stuff, which is the cal to al converter. I know a number of you are waiting for that, but I'm going through this because a few people probably haven't seen the tools, and we're going through a full OMA, well, I won't say a full, a quick overview of what's available. In the data tools also is Action Worksheet. This is an ability within the development environment to essentially define macros. So essentially, imagine now you might have certain needs where in a given development environment, or maybe from a development environment to development environment, that you need to recreate certain sets of actions. And therefore, you might want to run a number of different components in here in order to manage the data for your objects in such a way that makes sense to you. So in this particular case, you can see all these different functions. One of the things that we just added to the latest version of OMA, which is not what I have loaded here in this environment, actually, you'll see that one in just a moment. We've also added execute PowerShell. So if you'd like to use PowerShell, that is also now available. Quick little discussion on transports. We also have the ability now to organize your deployments. So what you can actually do here is define what we call projects. And a project is basically think of it as a deliverable, perhaps to a client, or as part of what you're trying to do for perhaps a set of deployment goals. So in here, you would define what it is that you're trying to do as a project. And from here, what you can then do is pull in the object that you need in order to package and deploy through what we call a transport, which is basically a container to deploy out your objects. And in here, when you select an object, you select which object type and object number, like you would normally do when creating an FOB package with a number of different objects. But what's different here is that you can actually pick the version of that particular object. If you might remember, we have history, so you can actually pick from history which version of that object. So if you think about, for example, perhaps you are customizing the customer table, and perhaps you have one customization where you need to add a field, and perhaps after you add that field, you have a secondary project in which you have to add a second field. So what is interesting is you can add that first field, save it, and that becomes an entry in history. And what you can then do is pull that one entry, history entry, into this project, so that when you deploy this project, it will go out with that customer with that one field. Once you've added that field to the customer table and saved it, you can actually then continue with your development and add your second field. And then once you've done that, then you can add that particular history entry of the customer table into your second project. So each project becomes a snapshot of the objects in time for that particular deployment, and allows you then to also go back and reference what was actually deployed at any point in time. So also very useful and gives you ability to look at things. All right, now that I've gone through a bit of a high level of OMA, let's talk now a little bit about where we are and where the future lies. All right, so we already know that we are very used to this development environment, which is the object designer and writing in CalCode. But Microsoft has already mandated and decided that into the future, this environment is going away. And in fact, officially as of Business Central version 15, which released a month ago, this is no longer accessible. The development environment is no longer accessible. You cannot write CalCode anymore. You have to write AL code. All right. So for those of you who already know, to develop an AL code, you will need to use VS Code. And for those of you who perhaps have not developed in AL code, this is our new development environment. Okay. So the new development environment is external to Business Central, to NAV. Right? So this is not part of Business Central, and all the development is actually managed primarily on file shares local to your machine, and perhaps centralized through a repository like SVN or Git or TFS or Azure DevOps. Some other centralized environment is where you would manage this code. So it's not through Business Central moving forward. Okay, so in this particular case, I have actually a bit of a development. It's actually something I was playing around with. And just to show it to you, I am actually going to open up actually where this resides. So this is actually living here on my local drive, and let me just move that over. And you can see here's all these objects. This is just something I'm playing around with. Now, I'm going to delete out all these objects for a moment because I'm going to be talking about how all of those got here. So as you can see, this is my path for the actual development app that I've got, and I created this initially in VS Code by doing a hello world, and that's how I actually got the original app JSON. Now, if you take a look at this, just to show you a little bit of what I have, my development environment, if you might remember, I started off actually on Business Central 14. And Business Central 14 is the last version of Business Central that allows us to develop inside Cal, using the Seaside development environment, and also supports development for VS Code, extensions, and AL code, and applying the AL extensions on top of my Business Central 14. So it is the last and only real version that allows you to have both development environments in one client. All right, and I'm going to talk more about that, and as I mentioned, why I started with Business Central 14. In this particular case, I've started VS Code, and I'm pointing to Business Central 15. So Business Central 15, again, was the one that was released a month ago and only supports AL code. Okay, so there's no CA code allowed inside Business Central 15. All right, so once again, I created all of this using my Hello World. So simply, for those who have not seen it before, I call up the command palette and just simply say go, and it allows me to start up my sort of initial sketch of a project. And then once I've got my app.json here, I came in here and just changed a few things, made sure my platform pointed to 15, and I changed some ID ranges, and that was about it. There's really not much here, okay? So having said that, now I'm going to show you the next part of our demo. And now we're going to get into the really neat stuff. So I'm now going to open up a different Business Central 14 Windows client. Okay, and you might be wondering, well, why is that? Why is this a different client, or at least a different database from where I was before? Well, once this starts up, I'll show you why. So this is, once again, Business Central version 14. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Object Manager Setup and show you some things that are a little different. And for those of you who are currently using OMA, this is now where you're going to see what's different. All right, so a few things that are different. First off is we've introduced a new database type called conversion. So as you can see, I've actually set up this particular development environment to be my conversion database. So this is where I'm going to take perfected CAL code and convert it to AL code. All right. The other environment that I was showing earlier was set to development. So that's where I'm doing my development, and I have my ongoing development there. And this is where I'm doing my conversion. Okay, so that's one thing that's different. All right. A few other things that are different. Let me scroll down here. Under the, let's see, I'll just scroll down this way, make it a little easier to get to. There we go. Under the save compiled version, we've also introduced a new option on this side, which is never. So in the case that you set this up as a conversion database, what this parameter does is it defines whether or not you save those blobs against every time you modify an object, right? So if you remember in the object history, we're storing all the blob files against every version. Here in the conversion database, we don't really need those blobs. So in order to save space, overhead, and to improve performance, we've given this option of never over here so that you don't need to store all of that overhead in object history on this side if it's not important to you. So never here is a choice, and it just allows us to work a little bit more streamlined over on this side. The other thing that is different with this latest version of OMA, by the way, this is OMA version 14. The one that I was showing previously was OMA 13. Okay, so OMA 14 was the one that we officially announced at Tech Days just last week in Antwerp, and I actually did a 15-minute presentation version of what you're seeing now. So if you can imagine, it was quite a hurried presentation, but today we're going to spend a little bit more time going through this. In any case, one other major area of change here in this conversion database is we've also added conversion checks. So this is where we have defined different things to check as we're converting from CAL to AL code. and you can enable or disable these things. And over time, we're adding more guideline checks, of course. But there's a number of different things in here. So for example, promoted action properties, just as an example, you may be aware, or perhaps you're not aware, that when you are writing AL code, you can promote an action, okay, which is fine. However, when you promote an action, you should probably assign it to a promoted category, so therefore the system knows, where to display it. But as far as the system is concerned, it is possible for you to promote an action without assigning it to an actual promoted category. So from a guidelines perspective, that's probably not a good thing. So the system automatically checks for those things and actually warns you that perhaps that's a guideline violation, and therefore you might want to check it out. Run on client, for example, is another one. This is to check the .NET variable property, which basically says for this .NET variable, is this .NET object, does it run on the nav server or does it run on a Windows client? And if you set this property to true on the variable, it means that it should run on a Windows client. However, starting with Business Central version 15, there is no Windows client, right? It's all web client only. So therefore, this property would fail under BC 15, and therefore another example of a guideline check that would be important. The other thing that we've also added here is now, I talked a little bit about extensibility earlier during guideline checks. So during conversion checks, we have now also made guideline checks during conversion to be extensible. So you actually now have the ability to extend upon events that we're now exposing within the OMA code units that does some of the guideline checks during conversion. And now you can actually extend and write your own subscriber code units to basically handle additional things. So that's also very cool. So it gives you more capabilities. All right. So now that you see the setup, what has happened here is basically I've set up this particular conversion database with base BC 15, BC 14 objects. So even though the container is BC 15, I've got BC 14 in here just as base objects. And what I've done is from my development environment, and actually in this case it's from a different development environment, I've actually brought in some modified objects. So as I bring them in here, you'll see now these are my so-called perfected objects that I want to convert to AL. So as you can see here, I have modified the customer table. And I also have some custom tables as well. I've modified the base customer card, and I also have a number of custom pages as well. All right. So I have these objects, and now I'm interested in perhaps taking these objects and converting them to AL. They're currently in CAL. The only thing I did to the customer table, just for your information, is I've added an additional field. In fact, let me show you that. Let me go into the history, and here's an example now of the history and the two entries with this particular actually, you know what? I will now do the compare just to show it to you. So I'll select those two, call compare. And in my particular case, I'm using beyond compare. And if we actually take a look at where the differences are, it's actually probably on this side. There it is. You can see that I've actually added a name field. Right. So, and as you can imagine on the page, I just simply exposed that name field onto the page. Okay, so very simple development change. Let me get out of this. Okay, so great. Now I've got this set of customized CAL objects and code. What do I do next? The next thing we do is we come over here to our object tools section, and now we've introduced in the latest version here of OMA 14, and basically a converter card. So if I open up this converter card, what you'll see now is in this card, I can define a number and name. which is great. And there's my local directory that I want to create and manage my AL code in. All right, and I gave you a glimpse of that directory just a few minutes earlier, and you might remember I deleted all the objects out of that directory. So you're probably already thinking ahead that I'd run this earlier, and I did. But as I, just in prepping for this in the last few minutes, I've deleted all those objects. You can define the starting object range that you want, ID range for your new objects. And you can also define here the prefix that you might want to use for your AL objects. Moving into the future, you can get this prefix from Microsoft. You'll need to go register it with them. Target type, you can define whether or not your target is going to be online or on-premise. In this case, that's online. And for the sake of argument right now, let's just say I'm taking my BC14 development, which is in Cal code, and I want to convert it to BC14 AL code. Okay, so let's just keep it simple for a moment. So basically BC14 to BC14, CAL to AL. I also have the ability, if I want, to generate the translation files automatically from captions. Just by clicking that checkbox, it will do it. In my particular case, I'm going to, you know what, I'll leave it on. That's fine. I'll take that and we'll leave it on. So that'll create the translation files, but there might be reasons why you might not want to do so. And what it'll do in that case is take your captions and move them over to the caption properties in your AL code. Some people during development like that ability just for the ability to reference it in the AL code as you're still further developing your AL code, and perhaps it just gives you a simpler way to look at the names of fields. But some people, you know, maybe that's not important. So go ahead, translate it, and it will eliminate the captions as it's doing it. Converter actions, it's going to apply 8 conversion actions. And again, you can choose which actions to apply or not apply. By default, as you can see, it's all of them, okay? And also during the conversion, it again will check guidelines, and just so you can see, here are some of the guidelines that are going to be checked and confirmed as you apply them. Now, that's the header. In the lines, what I've done is I've added the objects that I want as part of this project. So these are all my Seaside objects. Right? And once I've added my Seaside objects, for each one of these objects, especially the base objects, is I can, let me just do this, is I can then define what is the base object. In other words, point in history for that particular customer table, which version of the historical customer record do I want to use as my base object? Likely you'll probably want to use the original base version, but there might be reasons why you might choose a base version that is not the original base. Okay, so you do have that capability. When you choose the base object, the system will know that, in fact, what we want to do is look at a delta between the actual object. And by the way, when I add it here on the left-hand side, this is assumed to be the latest version of the object in my object history. And it will compare it to the base object and therefore know that it needs to generate a delta. And when it's generating a delta, it knows that it needs to create an extension. And in this case, there's the number and the new name that it will create. So you can also see against the page, I've done the same thing. I've selected the object and the base object. It knows that it's a delta and also knows what is the page extension, or it needs to be a page extension and what number, okay? At this point, what I'm going to do is up at the top is I will click on Convert Objects. So here we go, drum roll. Now, while it's doing that, let me go and open up VS Code. And you'll actually see it's creating the objects. So as you can see here, it's actually converted each one of those Seaside objects. And if I click on any one of these, like for example, let's look at the table extension. You can see it's created the table extension with my name field. Okay, and in fact, also within the within that table, I also had a function. So I didn't show that to you earlier, but in fact, it found it and pulled it out. Okay, when it compared it against the base object, it realized that there was a difference in the functions and also pulled it out and created the table extension. All right. So all the other types of objects, like the custom table objects, you can see it's also pulled those out and created the AL code for all of those. So all of that is correct and it works. Same thing with the pages, right? So those all work as well. Okay. In this particular case, the page extension seems to have an error. And if I click on it, you'll notice here it's actually not liking this reference. And the reason why this is coming through right now as showing as incorrect, what we're doing in our export to AL right now, Microsoft has stated that moving into the future that camel case is going to be the proper naming convention, and built into the OMA tool right now is support for camel case. But it turns out that this reference actually is not called that by Microsoft. It actually has this name, which is our old naming convention. And you'll notice that if I do this, it will actually resolve. So, so that's really the only thing that came out here. And you notice I corrected that. But moving forward, Microsoft is also trying to correct all those things from themselves. So you can see now all of this is acceptable, no errors against my symbols that I've downloaded from BC15. It's all correct. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go ahead and publish this. And you can see now I'm pushing out to BC15. Now, actually, I realized that I probably should have done one more step. Let me just back up. It actually published it okay, but I'm actually going to go back for a moment. Let me just stop this, and let me just go back to actually. Let me just log in here to show you BC15, and in fact that it actually went there. So here's my BC15. I don't want to save my password. And of course, we just need to give it a moment to cache up the data and make sure that everything shows up. I'm going to go into my customer. There we go. I'll open up a customer card. And you'll see there's the name 3 field. All right, so it did bring it over and it does exist. Now, having said that, let me go back here. One of the things I actually failed to show you, and it's actually super important, it just turns out that because my changes are not very complicated and my code is not very complicated, my BC15 accepted my BC14 conversion. But watch what happens here. If I actually switch from BC14 to BC15, as developers, you may be well aware that starting with BC15, Microsoft introduced a lot of changes into the BC15 product. And in fact, in BC15, there were a lot of changes that broke the application if you're coming from older versions of BC and NAV. And if I select BC15 here, this is what's interesting. Let me just switch back for a moment just so that I can call this out. You'll notice that the number of breaking changes here are 0. That's because I'm going from BC14 to BC14. If I go to BC15, Microsoft introduced 559 breaking changes. And if I drill into these are all the possible places that Microsoft broke the code. Okay, so what's nice about OMA is depending on your target version, it knows what the breaking changes are. And when you actually click on Convert Objects, it will actually fix the breaking changes. That, I want everybody to take a moment and digest that. If you are a developer in Business Central, in AL or CAL, especially if you're converting to AL, this is one of the most critical and difficult parts now of managing your development, is handling the breaking changes. So if there's anything that this product does in terms of adding value, is right here, the management of the breaking changes. Okay, so once again, I could have clicked on this And again, it will apply anything that is affected by the breaking changes. Again, because my code was very, very simple, there wouldn't have been a whole lot of impact on the actual code that actually got to my AL project. All right, so that's pretty much a discussion about development, converting CAL to AL. Actually, I'll show you a few more things while we're over here. So again, I'm in my conversion database. Let's just talk about a few more things before I switch back. In here in the conversion database, you also have a bunch of additional functionalities. You can support .Net, so move any of your .Net references over to the new environment. You can also generate permissions also for your AL environment. Here you can manually create those xlif files if you didn't have the xlif checkbox in the conversion routine set up. And this is also where now you can create SQL scripts in order to take the data from your development environment and be able to run this SQL script and move it to your new AL environment. So if I actually click on this and let that SQL script generate, what you will see actually, let me go grab my directory one more time. And let me just see, give me a moment. I need to find my directory. Once again, I'm on off screen in the background here, and I just need to grab the right thing. There we go. All right, and perfect. So let me pull this in. There we go. Perfect. Okay, and you'll see there's my SQL script. Okay, and it actually goes into my project. And if I go in here and just edit this, you'll see that in fact, there's the script that I need to run in order to transfer the actual data as well. Okay, so data is managed, code is managed. Let me get rid of those things. Okay, and at this point, let's talk now a little bit more about our development environment. So this is the conversion environment. Let me get rid of the conversion environment. Let's go back to development environment for a moment. So I am now going to go back to my, not this one, I believe it is. Give me a second. I have a number of different containers. I just want to make sure I open up the right one. I'll just close all these and I'll just open up the right one here. Perfect. And it's just starting up. Let me bring it in. Perfect. So I'm entering back into my BC14 development environment. So why am I showing you now the development environment? Well, after I've converted my objects from cal to al, I can continue to work inside this development environment and actually manage both my cal development and my al development. So let me show you. What we're going to do on this side in my development environment is now I can define an extension. And in this particular case, I have here pointed out my car app. And you might remember that once again, it's in this directory. And in this particular case, once I point to that directory, these objects actually automatically populated the lines. It's actually reading from that directory any valid AL object and pulling it in here so that I can actually see them as part of my extension card. Right, and basically here it's referencing the app JSON and using that to get into the actual AL code and find all these things. So once again, all I needed to do was simply create this card, point it to the directory where the app JSON is, and all of these things came in. And in fact, if I went to my project directory and deleted the AL objects out of that directory, all these things would actually disappear. Okay, so it's actually synchronized from my AL directory folder here to this card. Now let me close this. Once I've created this extension card, now what happens is in my development environment, if I go to my Object Explorer, I mentioned that this is an extension of my Object Designer. You'll notice that we have a custom field here called extension. And if I actually filter on this field called extension, what you'll now see is there's actually all the extensions as objects within my Object Explorer. And because it's here now, all those things that I showed earlier, which was basically the where used. So for example, let's say this card, and we say where used, you can actually take a look potentially at where is it pointing to. Now in this particular case, it's because I haven't run the refresh, it hasn't refreshed the data, but basically all these different things, you have access to the where used, you have access to history, you have access to check guidelines, everything here works. The other thing that's super cool about this is I showed you earlier that with the base objects, if I hit design, it opened up the object designer. Well, in this particular case, these are all extensions now written in AL code. If I click on design, guess what? It actually opens up VS Code and allows me to access that object and start modifying it and changing it. And once I save this AL file, it automatically updates here in my extension card and therefore also updates automatically here in my Object Explorer and updates history. So all the functionality that you had before in Object Explorer with CAL code also now applies to AL code. So let me see if there is much else I want to cover. Actually, I think that's likely all the things I'd like to cover for today. Let me just review a few more things. Let me just see if there's anything else I'd like to go through. At this point, actually, I'll take a few questions while I'm also just setting up to see if there's anything else that I'd like to go through. Does anybody else have any questions that they would like to ask? All right, none so far. All right, then that seems pretty good. Okay, just a few more things then to talk about, just real quick. We do have different functions inside the application. So we do have the ability, for example, if you were to take any one of these objects, let's just say for the sake of argument, I wanted to understand if I was to write from scratch, how would, let me just hit Control Home here. Let's just go all the way up to the top. Give me a second here. My keyboard is acting up a little bit. I'll just do it this way. There we go. Okay. So let's just say location table. Okay, this is a table that is very interesting to me in terms of its design and layout, and perhaps I want to create my own custom table that looks very similar to the location table, but I want to do it in AL. You also have the ability to export any base object into AL. So for example, here I click on that, and in this particular case, let me go to the same directory. So let me just go all the way through to my car app, and I'm going to export out my table 14 in AL. Okay, now obviously you wouldn't import it back in as part of my finished app, but you could use that as a template perhaps. Oh, that's interesting. Let's just clear that. Let me go look at VS Code and see if that actually showed up. And now you can see I have that location code. So I could also use this as a reference point in order to do further development modification. Okay, so lots and lots of stuff. And yes, there's a whole lot of stuff here that is not going to resolve because there's probably going to be a lot of different issues here. But again, gives you a chance to look at this and allow you to see things. All right. Yes.
Yeah, I can see we're running a little bit over time as we only scheduled an hour for this webinar, and I can see a lot of people have questions in the chat box, so we might want to answer those really quickly.
Okay, I apologize. Actually, for some reason in my schedule, it shows as an hour and a half.
Oh,
so
okay.
No problem. No
Can
problem.
you see the questions?
Yes, give me a moment, and let me just try to stretch out my window.
A lot of people are asking if you can convert from AL to CAL as well.
Yes. So the answer to that answer is yes. We can downgrade from AL to CAL, and you can also downgrade from CAL version to CAL version. So in other words, let's say you've got CAL version 14. You can also downgrade it down to, let's say, NAV 2013, because the system understands the metadata differences between the different versions. Okay. And Tamara, do you have? Yeah, there's lots of questions actually. I just realized the chat window is extremely small on my screen.
It is.
It's extremely difficult for me to see actually.
Someone's asking, is there any limitations when using the web client?
No limitations on web client. So web client works exactly the same as the Windows client, because as you all know, the web client is just simply an instance of the actual interface for Business Central. So yeah, everything that's in the web client is available in the web. Windows client is available in the web client.
And someone's asking that if it's correct that if you don't have a base version from a standard object on their dev environment, the convert version will not be able to create the extension.
That's correct. So you should be able to get a copy of the base version. So as a partner, you should be able to download that actual base version and load it up as part of setting up the conversion database.
I can see 3 more questions. So someone asking if it works with the OMA and let's say NAV gate editor.
That I don't know. I'll have somebody look into that a little bit deeper.
Okay. And
I think the answer to that is going to be no, because I think the Navigate editor requires some DLLs, and I don't think those are supported yet inside. Well, actually, I guess it depends on what your deployment environment is going to be and whether or not it supports those additional objects. So I'll have somebody else answer that one in deeper detail.
And is it possible to search for a field by its caption?
Can you find a field by its caption? Good question. I think the answer is going to be yes. I just don't know off the top of my head how you can do that. Just bear in mind that everything inside OMA is basically it parses all the metadata and stores it in tables in a referenceable manner, right? It's all normalized data, so therefore it's all there. How do we get to it? I'm not quite sure.
Okay. The last question I can see, is it possible to, would conversion from NAV 2009 work?
You would need to upgrade to 2013 at the very least. But yes, I mean, the OMA does have a lot of tools to help you convert. So you might have to do it in several steps.
Can you see the last question? It's a bit long.
I'm going to see if I can get to it.
Do you have a best practice guide if you have to convert a huge add-on not at once? If CAL development continues and yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Actually, on that last statement, for everyone else who is still here, I'm going to just quickly get through a few more slides. So on that note, this is my best practice recommendation, is if you have a development environment and you've written inline cal code on some older version of NAV, you're in the left-hand box. My recommendation is to take that code and upgrade to BC14. So basically move the code for code, so nothing moves. You've got cal code from your old version to cal code on BC14. So do an upgrade first. Then, while you're in BC14, refactor that code, move that cal code to events, all in cal code. And once you've got it all evented, then move that to AL code using the converter. And at that point, everything now lives in an extension, and you should be able to peel off the old version of BC14 at some point, and then be on the latest version of BC, which is what I call version next. Okay, and just for everybody here, Microsoft has officially announced that Business Central version 14 is supported all the way through the year 2023, and therefore now you have approximately 4 years to be able to do this. So it doesn't have to happen all at once, and because you're doing it this way, you can have Seaside, cal code and al code living together in the same environment. Okay, the last couple slides real quick, I'm just going to slide through here. Some people have asked me what's the difference between OMA and text to AL. Lots of different things that you can do. You don't need to set up containers. You can see that we can push a single button and handle it all for you. You also saw that we handled the breaking changes, which is a big thing. All right, we've got the SQL scripts to move the data. Because you've got the OMA tool for refactoring, you can find all the issues and fix them a lot easier. And as you can saw or see from the actual Object Explorer, you can get to VS Code and manage all of it exactly the same way that you used to manage Seaside code in OMA. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I know that Tamara wanted me to talk a little bit about partner licensing. I'm going to quickly just show this on the screen. Again, this deck will be available so that if you want to reference more of it, you can do so. There's also a subscription license available. So please reach out to us if you have any more questions about all this. So I do apologize. I went over. I was, I guess, a bit misinformed in terms of how long the session was going to be. But in any case, I thank everybody. And again, any questions, please reach out to us and let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you.